Hi everyone and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Content Manager at Goodlord. Today's episode is a recording of a webinar, our first official lettings legislation update of the year. We have touched on legislation in some of our previous webinars, but this is a deep dive into a few key topics. In the session, Oli Sherlock, Goodlord's Director of Insurance, was joined by Robert Bolwell, Senior Partner at Dutton Gregory, to talk through the Scottish rent freeze, short-term let rules, trends around tenants on benefits and much more. So without any further ado, on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Goodlord webinar. I have the pleasure of being joined shortly by Robert Bolwell, Senior Partner at Dutton Gregory. My name's Oli Sherlock. I'm Director of Insurance here at Goodlord. I'm going to help you guide through today's webinar, in which we're focusing on lettings legislation. We'll get an update from Robert across a plethora of sort of changes and potential challenges that legislative changes is throwing at us as an industry. So very keen to sort of go through Robert's thoughts on a number of those. For those of you who don't know who Goodlord is, most of our webinars aren't actually about Goodlord. They're about the market, they're about the industry as a whole. But for those who don't know who Goodlord are, we're a pre-tenancy platform. We expedite and streamline your entire pre-tenancy process. Everything from AST creation to payments, to rent collection, to rent protection insurance. We cover the entire journey. And we support over 2,500 letting agents across the UK in ensuring they have the best possible rental experience to promote to their landlords and to their tenants. If you want to understand more about what Goodlord do, you can visit our website at goodlord.co. That is enough about Goodlord. Like I say, that is not the purpose of today's webinar. We want to understand what legislative changes are coming down the tracks. There's been quite a lot going on across different borders in both Wales and Scotland, which we're going to cover today as well. And as I said earlier, it's a pleasure to be joined by Robert. Are you there this morning, Robert?
Very well. Good morning, Oli. Good morning, Sarah. Good morning, agents. Good morning, everybody out there. And yeah, welcome to this latest webinar. It's a real mixture of stuff we're going to talk about today, but I want to encourage you to, use the facility to raise questions as we go through. Oli will put those questions to me or say something at the end maybe, but there's a whole plethora. So I am over to you. Happy to start.
Just before we do, Robert, I mean, I can't believe there's many industry that don't know who Robert Bolwell is. You're a pretty active member of the sector, but it might be worth just giving us just a 30 seconds intro to your experiences and what your role is at Dutton Gregory.
30 seconds. Well, I guess I'm head of the landlord and tenant team here at Dutton Gregory. We're a firm of lawyers based in Hampshire, although to be honest, these days, it doesn't matter where you are, you can do stuff right the way across the country. And we set up a bespoke landlord and tenant team really back in the early 90s on the back of something called the Housing Act of 2008, which seems like another world ago. But no, we've got about 15 staff. I guess our big claim to fame at the moment is that we provide the telephone helpline services for ALA members. And I know there's a lot of overlap between what Goodlord does and the support you get from ALA and vice versa. So I hope many of your viewers today, people taking part in this webinar, will already have access to the ALA helpline service that we provide. We'll probably tell you how fantastic it is, but we're here to answer questions from ALA members on anything from routine to the esoteric. But we provide that vital support, that reassurance very often for agents taking matters forward.
And what a time to be doing that, because there's been substantial change, and I think agents and landlords alike are maybe as confused as the rest of us at times, because it's quite a hard market to navigate and quite hard to know that, one, are you doing the right things, but also with such change in the air, then, what agents want you to be true maybe is no longer true. So a really valuable service to offer, especially at the moment.
Yeah, I have to say, what always amazes me about our industry is you can take a guy or a girl from the sales department of a firm, take them from sales and put them into lettings, and they really don't know what's hit them. Sales legislation doesn't really change much on the sales side. Okay, we've got trading standards, we've got a guy called James Monroe changing things on disclosure regulations. But when you go from sales to lettings, all of a sudden your colleagues realise that lettings is far more complicated now than it's ever been in the past. The amount of stuff you need to know just to rent out a property, average AST and not fall foul of regulations is absolutely phenomenal. And how agents survive without services like Goodlord giving them information, without paperYour? I really don't know. They're operating in a vacuum, and that can be very, very expensive. But we can talk about PI insurance later on. But no, I think, people like Goodlord, people like paperYour, National Landlords Association, they all provide essential information services, and that's what we're doing at the same time.
Well, let's get into them, because today we're here to try and highlight some of the things coming down the tracks, as it were. We're going to start off with a brief update on the Renters Reform Bill. There's been a lot of noise about the Reform Bill in terms of from the market. Maybe less noise from Mr. Gove in the last few weeks, which we're looking for some kind of direction as to what's going to happen here and when. So we're going to cover that today. We're going to look up north of the border, because it was once true, I think, in lettings, especially from a market perspective, that what happens in London has a ripple effect outwards. Actually, I think it's from a legislative perspective more true to say that what's happening in Scotland is going to have a ripple effect downwards, and we're going to cover that and what sort of the Scottish sort of changes are looking like, and also what we can take from that to inform us of changes in England as well, and also looking at Scotland, at Wales briefly as well. We're going to cover new short-term lets. There's been a lot of questions around the processes here, but also some of the changes that are coming down the tracks. Obviously, with some of the Reform Bill changes, there were concerns around short-term lets becoming more and more frequent. So we can cover that as well. And lastly, we're going to cover off benefit applicants and discrimination trends. Robert has a very, very interesting case study, for want of a better phrase, that he's working on at the moment, that I think once he shares this with you, we'll put you on high alert for watching out for certain emails, but also reads a bit like a thriller. It's quite an interesting case. So we're going to cover that, and he's going to share that experience with you, which I think may prompt maybe a few questions. As I've said, the live Q&A is on throughout, so please do put your questions to us throughout the session. We've already got a question, actually, and it says, can you confirm the best number to contact Dutton Gregory on? We're going to come to that in one of the slides, actually. We can provide that number later in the webinar. So thank you for that question. You didn't leave a name, but good morning to whoever you are. If you do put a question on the Q&A, please try and leave your name. It's nice to know who we're speaking to. Let's get into it. Robert, Renters Reform Bill has been on the agenda for, the best part of 4 years now, nearly. We last saw a white paper coming out of the government 4 or 5 weeks ago. We saw the reaction to the call of evidence from a group of MPs. It doesn't feel, though, we're much further forward with knowing when this thing's actually going to hit. So I'm going to almost start in reverse of this slide and start with timing first. Talk me through your thoughts of when we think that this kind of change is going to actually come into force.
Well, you're absolutely right, Ollie. Things are a little bit uncertain. I mean, the Queen, God rest her soul, she first mentioned this idea of scrapping Section 21 notices in the Queen's speech way back in 2019. And you're right, that was 4 years ago. Obviously, we had the pandemic, which put timings completely out the window. But then last summer, we had this long-awaited white paper. It's all part of the Michael Gove's levelling up agenda. And he came up with, lots of really great ideas, according to some people, and lots of really pretty awful ideas, according to some of us. Now, since then, he hasn't given that many public interviews specifically on the Renters Reform Bill. When he appeared on the Today programme right at the end of last year, he was asked about timing, because when the white paper was published, the idea was we'd get the bill within a year. So by June, July 23, we would get the bill. Then something was said by the relevant ministry department, which suggests the bill wouldn't be here until September of 23. And then on the Today programme at the end of last year, he said it would be the end of the calendar year, 2023. So we don't really know which of those dates it's going to be. But if we take it at the end of 2023, I would have severe doubts as to whether we'll see this on the statute book before the election. Because just to explain, at the moment, we have to have an election under current legislation. I think it's by the end of the second week of January 2025. Now, a bill like this is not going to go through in a couple of weeks. It'll probably take the best part of the year to go from being a bill in front of Parliament, from the House of Commons, House of Lords, House of Commons, House of Lords. It's going to take the best part of a year. So think about the timeline. If we do get this bill by September of this year, out on 12 months, we could see legislation in September of 24. Okay, follow my logic? Now, in this country, The legislation comes into effect on one of two dates, either the 1st of October every year or the 1st of April. Now, if we do get a bill becoming an Act of Parliament in September of 24, it probably won't be implemented on the 1st of October 24. It can be the 1st of April 25. And that's absolutely fine. But if that bill is interrupted by a general election, and say we have a Labour government return, which is, a distinct possibility at the moment, if that legislative process is interrupted, the bill might completely fail. In which case, we could be looking at what Labour might do if they form the next government sometime in 25. So at the moment, we just don't know. If you want me to bet, if Michael Gove doesn't give us the bill until the end of 23, I don't think it'll go through with this government in power. It might have to await the general election, and then all bets are off. One thing Michael Gove has said quite categorically in every interview he's given is that there won't be any rent control measures in his bill. What he wants to do is limit the ability of landlords to increase rent on an existing tenancy. I mean, at the moment, if you want to increase the rent on an existing tenancy, there are a couple of ways of doing it. Obviously, you can have an agreement with the tenant to increase the rent to whatever you agree, or you can rely on a rent increase clause actually in the body of your agreement, or if all else fails, you've got this thing called a Section 13 notice. Now, under the 1988 Act, you can increase the rent under that notice once a year. Michael Gove wants to change that, so you can only increase the rent once every 2 years. But there's nothing he said to date which would mean, no, there will be total rent controls, caps and all the rest of it. Nothing at all. But of course, if this bill doesn't go through under the current government, and we do have a change of colour in our ruling party after a general election, I don't know what the Labour government would do with a revamped or reformed renters bill in 2025. So at the moment, we just don't know. I would like to think that if everyone pulls their fingers out, we might get a bill by September, which means we're back on track to get it through for September 24 before an election, which means, yes, we could have legislation 1st of April 2025. But to be honest, Ollie, nobody really knows. And Michael Gove is not being drawn on this at all, I'm afraid. So that's the timing.
And in terms of the change of government, I think the crossover is an interesting one. Lisa Nandy was very clear about a month ago that in the first 100 days of a Labour government, they've made some really keen pledges on how they're going to solve, as they see it, the problems in the PRS, including extended notice periods, for example, up to 4 months. I would certainly advise everyone to go and look as to what Labour has said around their sort of their suggestions of how they're going to answer some of these problems. Because, like you say, Robert, if the timeline goes in that manner, that becomes extremely important as to where we're going to end up from a reform perspective. My general feeling on this, it's unfortunate because the whole point of reform was trying to make the PRS a better place to live, as it were, a better place for landlords, a better place for tenants. And, you can agree or disagree on whether the virtues of the white paper do that. I think ultimately, this state of flux that we're in is just unhelpful for everybody concerned, and provides that lack of certainty. That's never going to be a good thing in terms of making sure that letting agents and landlords know how to act and how to act responsibly. But there are certain elements of the bill that maybe haven't got as much airtime as others. And you'll see that the idea of Section 21 being abolished isn't on this slide. I think we've maybe talked that to death. I don't think it needs any more airtime than it's already had. I would hasten to add, though, I think one of the biggest changes that hasn't had the relative airtime that it deserves is the fact that we're going to go into a world of periodic tenancies. So just talk us through what the suggestion there is, just to remind the viewers, because there's two stages to those changes, aren't there? There's an initial 12-month period and then a 12-month period, I think, thereafter.
Yeah, if you think about it logically, if you are getting rid of no-fault evictions, if you're getting rid of the whole Section 21 concept, and every political party has signed up that idea, if you can't get rid of a tenant at the end of a fixed-term tenancy, why have a fixed-term tenancy in the first place? So it's fairly radical thinking. What's been suggested is that from day one, you sign up a tenancy on, say, the 1st of January, and your tenancy will be a rolling periodic tenancy. And the period will be determined by the interval at which rent is paid. So if you think about it, at the moment, we have fixed-term tenancies, And at the end of that fixed term tenancy, you go on to a rolling periodic tenancy. In other words, it goes from month to month to month until you serve your Section 21 or whatever. Now, under the new proposals, that's effectively what you're going to have in the future. No fixed term. It'll be a rolling periodic tenancy from month to month to month until. Now, it's until you want to get the property back to sell it, or until you want to get the property back to put a close family member in the property, or until the tenant decides they want to go, or until there's some substantial breach and you can repossess the property under the normal Section 8 procedure. So that's the proposal going forward. Now, there are a few quirks in this. Number one, if you're an agent who charges your landlord commission at the very start of a tenancy for the whole of the fixed term, and I have to say, Oli, I know there are a lot of agents, especially in London, that do this. You sign up a 12-month tenancy on the 1st of January, poor old landlord gets a bill for the commission for the whole 12 months. That's going to have to change. You're not going to find a landlord who's going to be happy to pay you 12 months commission when he hasn't got a fixed term tenancy. You know, in 2 months' time, tenants could vote with their feet, give you notice and move out. So that billing model, that cash flow model is going to have to change if this is something that your agency does. The other slightly weird thing about the proposal in the white paper was that the fixed term tenancies would apply if you were a student in purpose-built student accommodation. Yeah. In other words, you know your student's going to be 12-month academic year, so again, they get a fixed term tenancy, they move out at the end. Well, it was pointed out by a crossbench committee that a lot of students might live in purpose-built student accommodation in year one at university, but in years 2 and 3, where are they? They're in the private rented sector. So when this was looked at last month by a committee, they did suggest to Michael Gove that that whole area needs to be looked at again, and whether we should perhaps retain some sort of Section 21 equivalent to make sure that we can get student accommodation back, whether it's a PRS or purpose-built accommodation, we can get that accommodation back at the end of the academic year. I mean, if we don't have some changes to Michael Gove's original ideas, you're going to have all sorts of problems trying to get a property back when one student moves out or one of them is no longer a student. So that's going to be looked at. And we're waiting at the moment for Michael Gove's ministry to come up with some new ideas on that. But the big thing, yes, ending fixed term tenancies. That one, I think, passed the mail on Sunday by. They were just fixating on your Section 21 issue. But no, there are lots of other things coming.
And with that and with those other things in mind, we've got a few questions coming in already. So thank you for those. We've got a question from Beth. Good morning, Beth. Beth says we normally do a lease renewal and then discuss the rent increase. Is this not the right process? Looking forwards, Robert, that process is going to need to change, right? Because they're going to be confined by the Section 13 process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complete double whammy. I mean, number one, there will be no renegotiation of the lease because the lease or the tenancy continues. Right. It continues month to month to month. So, but number two, how much income do agents get from negotiating those lease renewals? Now, if you can't force a tenant to sign a new lease because it's rolling on anyway, that could be another income stream which is going to be compromised. Now, you can obviously agree a rent increase midway through a tenancy, or more importantly, you have a clause built into your tenancy agreement to give you a rent increase mechanism. Now, and I'll try to plug Arla, but I mean, if your members out there are also members of Arla, they know they've got access to the Arla tenancy agreement, and there's a clause in there. And I suspect if we have a look at the Goodlord tenancy agreement, yes, there are options already built into the Goodlord AST to have automatic rent increases. And if you've got that in your tenancy already, that takes priority over the what I call the Section 13 procedure. Now, whether Michael Gove implements his threat to limit rent increase to one increase every 2 years, we'll have to wait and see. But at the moment, if you have got a rent increase clause that says it's 10% increase every year or every 6 months, at the moment, that's what you go for. But in the future, it's going to be a double whammy. There will be no automatic end to a tenancy, so there's no incentive for a tenant to sign a new agreement. And if you're not renegotiating a new agreement, that's going to hit your income stream.
Questions are coming thick and fast. I'm going to cover as many of these now if we can whilst we're on this slide. Ronke, good morning, Ronke, says, asks even, is there a certain percentage the landlord can increase the rent to, please?
Where is your colour coming from? Now, if it's England, at the moment, no. Not at all. But what you've got to understand is that every AST, every short-term tenancy, is subject to the oversight of the first tier tribunal, we used to call the rent committee, and you cannot increase your tenancy rent above the market value in England. So in theory, if you try to increase the rent above a certain figure, whether or not you're relying on the Section 13 procedure or otherwise, yes, your tenant could, if they know their rights, and it's a very big if, I'm afraid, they could actually take the landlord to the first tier tribunal, and the tribunal could say, no, we think, looking at comparables, the appropriate rent for this property is X, Y, and Z. So in theory, you can increase it, but you've always got that first tier tribunal overarching jurisdiction. Now, we're going to talk about Scotland in a bit. Scotland has reacted to the cost of living crisis, you want to call it that, by capping the amount you can increase the rent by in Scotland on an existing tenancy. But I think we'll come to that in a moment, Ollie.
Indeed. We have another point made from who hasn't left the name. The government appears to have forgotten about Roper. Is there any further information on whether or not this is even going to happen?
No, we just don't know. I mean, the weird thing about the white paper, I can't remember how many pages, it's literally hundreds of pages long, and a lot of it was all to do with levelling up. The bit which we were concerned about, I think it's only about 80 odd pages. So there's been more put in print since then than we actually saw last summer when the white paper came out. Now, one of the problems we have, and it's something I keep going on about, is the number of housing ministers we've had over the last 20 years is just phenomenal. I think last year alone we had something like 6 different housing ministers. I think someone said we've had 20 since the year 2000. I mean, can you imagine if we changed the CEO of Goodlord every few months? I mean, planning for the future would be very, very difficult. You know, and again, contrast that with Scotland, where they seem to have a far more stable number of people, you know, in their ministry equivalent up there.
And we've got a few sort of, I think, points more than questions, maybe. Chris, good morning, Chris, says getting rid of fixed terms is snake oil, as it won't change how you can actually evict a tenant. Truth be told, the government don't want private landlords to be able to evict tenants. I can somewhat see how you've got to that point, Chris, given the amount of barriers that feel like are being put down. Alexis, good morning, Alexis, makes another point, and this is quite a pertinent one, actually. My tenants are worried about the end of fixed terms. They prefer the security of knowing that they're there for at least a year plus, which I can sympathise with, especially in a market where stock is so short and supply and demand is so high. Actually, having the security there may well be beneficial. So I can understand their point there, Alexis, and one that ultimately, I suppose, doesn't change too much with periodic. They have a level of they have a level of control, but knowing that you've got a contract for 1 or 2 years, for example, I get. We've got a question from Lou Fletcher. Good morning, Lou. How does the concept of periodic tenancies give tenants any security in respect of landlords who choose to sell? Robert, presumably landlords will not be able to seek possession to sell within 12 months of the start of the tenancy.
Yeah, whether it's 6 months or 12 months, we don't know. Wait to see the bill. But eventually, yes, at some date, you'll be able to serve the equivalent of a Section 21. It'll be a Section 8 notice, but 2 months. And yes, at the end of that period, if the tenant is still there and the landlord is selling, yeah, he can go to court and get a court order. Now, though we haven't seen it yet, there's going to be all sorts of anti-avoidance measures built in. So whether you can serve that notice at 6 months or 12 months, we don't know. It's probably going to be 12 months. At the moment, it looks like it's going to be a 2-month notice, but of course, at least one committee has said, no, it should be longer than that. You should give your tenants at least 6 months notice before you go to court. And then, of course, what happens in that situation where the landlord changes his mind? He gets the property back on a Monday, and on Tuesday he changes his mind and doesn't put it on the market. So there's going to be all sorts of anti-avoidance legislation. I mean, it's going to be fairly complicated, but there's got to be a way to make sure that landlords don't put in spurious unselling claims, get a possession order, and then change their mind. But you know, the detail is going to be to come.
And just before we move on to the next slide, Lisa's come back to your point around the charging mechanism. I think if you're sat on this webinar as a letting agent and you haven't started to think how the move to periodic is going to affect your cash flow, but the mechanism which you sort of purvey your proposition out to your landlords, you need to start thinking about it now. And we're certainly here to help you with that, because there are going to be ways that you can have parity, if not arguably improve your revenue per let and deliver different levels of service to your landlords that actually add more value in the new world. But any lack of action now, I think, will be troublesome. Moving forwards. And Lisa asks that the rent collection and management fee can be charged monthly. How are we going to charge let-only fees if we can't charge up front? I think Robert's point isn't that you can't charge up front. You can indeed, and for let-onlys, I think that would still hold true. But the point Robert was making was that actually, if you're asking a landlord to buy into, say, paying 12 months worth of management fee up front, when the landlord has no certainty that they're going to have a tenant for 12 months, that's going to be a pretty hard sell, maybe. And I think that's a very, very key point to recognise, depending what your charging model is at the moment. But if you want more information around how the legislation is going to change potentially how your business model works, we are going to be running different sessions here at Goodlord on that, and we have some mechanisms and tools that you could use to try and change that ahead of time, so it doesn't feel as troublesome as and when the changes come in. Let's move on. I'm conscious of time, and we're on for the first slide. We have got more questions. I will come to some of those as we move forward. Thank you so much for posting those. One final point on the Renters Reform Bill. A lot of the new legislative changes are going to require more interaction from a court if and when there's cases that need to be processed with the abolishment of Section 21. There's cases that need to be processed. Abolishment of Section 21. So I'm getting some feedback here. What are the government actually doing around the courts and the bandwidth? What are the government actually doing around the courts and the bandwidth for the court government?
Okay, well, the idea of using a Section 21 to get rid of a tenant at the moment, and I use the term politely, get rid of a tenant, is that you have some certainty. If you serve the right bits of paper, you're not going to get into an argument over disrepair, rent arrears, you simply get the property back. So a lot of landlords who are really wanting a property back because the tenant's done something wrong, use the Section 21 process. It's quick, it's relatively cheap, etc., etc. So the government are actually alive to this, and they're saying, look, we appreciate that we're going to have to revamp the whole thing of about getting tenants out of a property. So there will be new Section 8 grounds, and there will be help with the court service to make sure things happen a little bit quicker than they perhaps do at the moment. The one irony, of course, Ollie, is, do you want to guess who the Justice Minister was 10 years ago who started slashing court budgets? I gave the game away, didn't I?
I imagine it's the very same person who's now in charge of trying to level up the entire process, Mr. Gove.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's slight irony here. 10 years ago, he was slashing budgets, closing courts left, right, and centre. Now he's had to admit that, yes, we need more resource in the courts. Now, this is where we have an interesting parallel with Scotland. Scotland have got the same problem that we had 5 or 6 years ago. So what did they do? They introduced a specialist housing court. And if you have members north of the border, they will tell you the housing court there works really well. It's streamlined, it's fast. You don't necessarily have judges making decisions. You'll have experienced landlord and tenant practitioners, lawyers who may not be a judge. And it works really well. And one of the committees that looked at the white paper said, look, we should follow the example of Scotland. We should do what they have done. Whether or not the Ministry of Justice and Michael Gove in his new job say, yes, we're going to follow Scotland, we simply don't know. One problem we do have here, of course, is money. There is just no money to pay for an extra court service. And what we wouldn't want to do is set up a court service, but take money out of the existing courts for the housing court, robbing Peter to pay Paul. But that would be great if we could do it. So, devils in detail, watch this space. But I would love a specialist housing court. I really would.
Agreed. And especially from my position in managing the rent protection book, it's having a consistent and robust, efficient court process is in everybody's interest, including tenants, frankly, to expedite that process. You talk about Scotland there. Let's move on to the next slide, because ultimately, as we said at the top of the call, Scotland can act as some level of precursors to what we're going to experience and the effects of that. Just talk us through sort of what's happened in Scotland and what restrictions they've put in place, and because they have taken further action from a cost of living perspective alongside previous legislative changes that were out of kilter with what England especially have been doing. So talk us through the changes in Scotland.
Yeah, now all this is, I've got to have a word of health warning here, because property market, most of you know, they have challenged the Scottish Government over the legislation is to reduce freezing rents. So there could well be a big development coming in a couple of months' time, but that's on the back burner at the moment. But their legislation is being challenged. But at the moment, what they did, and they did it very quickly, it's last year, they reacted to the cost of living increase by saying, okay, fine, you cannot, landlords, increase existing rents. No restriction on rents for new properties that are empty, that you're putting a new tenant in, say, but if you've got an existing tenant and you want to increase the rent, it's a complete no-no. Now, they looked at everything over the course of the last few months, and we have some very important changes coming on the 1st of April. So as from the 1st of April, landlords in Scotland will be able to increase rent. They have to serve the appropriate notice, but their rent increase will be limited to a maximum of 3% of the current rent. But if the landlord himself has got a bit of a cost of living crisis because his mortgage has gone up, his utility bills have gone up, landlords there can actually increase rent to up to 6%, but they've got to go through effectively the rent of the Scottish Rent Service to make sure any increase is approved. So they've limited from the 1st of April the increases you can see in Scotland. Of course, in England, there is no limit. The limit in England is market rents, effectively, or whatever you say in your tenancy agreement. So Scotland have acted very quickly to protect tenants from big rises. What they've also done in Scotland is they've introduced a restriction on evictions. Now, there are all sorts of exceptions, but the general rule is you get a possession order in Scotland because you want your property back, but you can't enforce it for 6 months or until the end of September, whichever is the sooner. Now, so there are exceptions for very high rent arrears cases. You can still get your property back. But the general proposition is the Scottish Government has acted to try and help people who are renting property at the lower end of the market so we don't get an influx of people to local authorities seeking local authority assistance. But that's what Scotland's done. I have to say England hasn't really done anything to protect tenants at the moment, despite the cost of living crisis. Yes, we've got that contribution towards our bills, our utility bills, but England has not done anything specifically to protect our tenants. Again, a bit of a contrast to what they do north of the border, or don't do south of the border.
And one of the challenges here is, I suppose, that the Scottish, the action that the Scottish Government have taken has, on the face of it, answered the calls of tenants for support. But in reality, the rental market is still a free market. It works on supply and demand. It also works on landlord-based costs, which have risen quite dramatically. So whilst you might assume, because there's been a cap on rent in Scotland, that would limit the increase in rents in Scotland, actually the opposite is true. What has happened in Scotland and what continues to happen, and under the new changes will still happen, by the sound of it, is that actually the moment that property comes off the market, i.e. a tenant moves out or is evicted through an appropriate means, then when the property returns to market, that could hypothetically go from £1,000 to £2,000 because it's a new tenancy. And actually, we're seeing vast increases in rent in Scotland through that process, aren't we?
What you're getting, Ollie, are two markets. You're getting one market which reflects when the property last was vacant, and if it's vacant now, you're going to get a much higher rent. And the other market, tenants who are holding over on old tenancies. So you're going to get this incredible disparity between existing tenants who've been there for a year or so and new tenants who've just moved in. Now, at some stage, logic dictates that market has got to get back to a state of equilibrium. So when these restrictions end, and I have to assume they will be ending at some stage as the government keeps on renewing the legislation, there is going to be a massive increase in rents for those people who've been there, say, for a couple of years and had the benefit of this legislation from last September. So at the moment, you're having two different markets in Scotland, which is completely artificial. The only good thing about England, of course, is we've got one market, but we know that rents have gone up quite significantly over the last 12 months in England for all sorts of reasons.
I was on a focus group with some of our customers last week, and one of those was a large Scottish agent. And they were very clear on the effect of these changes and how that's dramatically led to landlords either already exiting or wanting to exit the market because of the pressures that have been put on them. So I think there's some good and bad in Scotland. I think your point around the housing courts in Scotland is definitely accurate. I think the mechanisms in which the Scottish Government have taken to try and limit the effect of the cost of living crisis on tenants seems to have somewhat backfired. Now, you would hope that the government look at this and learn from this and actually look at the data, because that's really what's important. And to your point around the change in government, potentially, we know that Labour are more pro rent caps than maybe the incumbent government. We know that in London, for example, Sadiq Khan has been very vocal about wanting to cap rents in London. I would argue that it does not work, and there's clear evidence it doesn't work. And ultimately, it's going to be very interesting to see how the timelines cross over. Because if the reform bill doesn't get delivered in the manner that you talked through earlier, Robert, and we lead into that new government, then there's going to be some quite big questions posed of a new government. And we should be careful what we wish for, I suppose, because at the end of the day, all of this reform, I think we all accept, is about making a better PRS, a better rental experience for tenants, a better standard of living for tenants. I think we all want that, but not quite convinced that rent caps are the way to go about doing that, frankly. Looking at Wales, Wales is slightly... Sorry, Robert.
No, I was going to say is all of this talking about rent caps and limits, it hides the essential problem that we have in this country, is that our PRS, by and large, is governed by market forces. And market means supply and demand. In a situation where we're just not building the appropriate number of homes anymore, there is always going to be this imbalance, which means on one hand, great for landlords, but it's not good for the country. Once upon a time, we did have this target of 300,000 new properties or new homes being built every single year. Well, that's been scrapped by this government. I think Michael Gove was, I don't think targets are very helpful. Well, of course they're not helpful if you can't get anywhere close to target. So until we start building more, I think in the last, you might know this, I think in the last committee that looked at the white paper, they said there we need at least 90,000 social houses every year. Well, we're not building those, let alone those in the private sector. So whilst this imbalance continues, yes, it might be great for landlords in the short term, might be great for our industry because we're all going to have jobs. I think for the country, we need to get close to, if not equilibrium, but certainly building more homes for the growing population.
I think the points around targets is quite hilarious, actually. I tried to have this conversation with my CEO to say the targets he sets me are just not helpful. And I prefer them to be aspirational. Just the ones that I can't hit were mainly the ones that I had focused on. But it's laughable that we say that, we remove something that we can't hit and call it. And I think the phraseology was, these are now aspirations rather than targets. It's easy to lay blame at this government. This is successive governments that have failed to hit the housing target that's required to meet the demands of the growing population. And the fact that the social housing objectives are so far behind alongside the rest of the PRS and the rest of the new home building targets really shows and speaks to how those two things have bled into one another. The PRS now is holding up and trying to support many different demographics of individuals, whereas before 20 years ago, maybe, that wasn't the case. There was more clearly defined. So, that's a whole different webinar. But I just want to touch on Wales, Robert, because Wales have taken a different view again. They've actually launched new legislation and looked to sort of a lengthened notice period, for example. What's your view on how well Wales have managed this process of reform, and what are the early signs as to whether that's working or not?
At the moment, I think it's too early to say. It all kicked in last December, but the lead-in time has been phenomenal. The legislation has been effectively on the books now for about 6 or 7 years, but it kicked in last December. And what happens in Wales is you've got to give everybody a new contract, a new tenancy, effectively, though we don't call them tenancies anymore. And you've got this date in May by the time you've got to sort of get everything in line. I think at the moment, I haven't had any feedback to say that landlords are throwing up their hands in abject horror. You still have the ability to get rid of a tenant on a no-fault basis. So, I could see a situation where, encouraged by what Wales are doing, but discouraged by what England's doing, if I am living in a border county, I might decide to sell property in England and buy one in Wales. But, again, in many ways, Wales are ahead of the game. They've recognised that we do need to get tenants out in certain circumstances. They do effectively have a register of landlords there because you need to register the fact that you are a landlord. And they have more regulation for agents. You've got to pass a fairly rudimentary exam before you can be an agent. So, we've got Scotland ahead of us. We've got Wales ahead of us. And I just hope that Michael Gove uses his white paper and the Renters Reform Bill to do a bit of catch-up here. Personally, I think it's crazy. We've got 3 different systems, or if you like 4 different systems with Northern Ireland in one, very small area. On the helpline that we run, if we get somebody with a Welsh accent, we have to ask them, are you actually in Wales? And sometimes we're giving answers on the basis of an English caller, but they say, oh, no, the properties in Wales. So we've got to sort of start all over again. So we do have multiple systems in one very small island. But that's devolution. That's part of the problem of devolution. And that's not going to go away.
No, not at all. And arguably, we've got three or four different views of what could work and what doesn't work. Actually, so there's some merit in the different things that the different steps have been taken. But for individuals and businesses like ourselves that service all those areas, it does become somewhat confusing at times, and quite hard to ensure that you're giving the accurate advice according to where that property is based. We've got a few questions that have come in through this slide. We've got a few points actually, again more than questions. Chris, good morning, Chris. Chris says everything has gone up considerably. Why pick on rents? I understand that. I think when you look at landlords' costs, especially from an interest rate perspective, some landlords' base costs have been hugely increased quite quickly, and that is a struggle to pass that on. So I think at the end of the day, we're all under the same umbrella when it comes to sort of inflationary disadvantages and interest rate increases. That's part of the crisis that we're in. Chris also says that the government needs to look in the mirror for the housing situation. I think we would broadly agree from a home building perspective that there's an answer to be sort of put to their door there. Anthony asks, regarding rent increases, if the government freezes rent, the market rent base for rent tribunal cases could be frozen for 100 years. I'm unsure whether what he means by that, if I'm being perfectly honest, Robert.
If the government want to freeze rents, they've got to pass, fairly sweeping legislation, because at the moment it's quite clear you can increase the rent to a market rent. Now, you'd have to change that legislation, on day one. And of course, Scotland did by introducing a new piece of legislation. There would be an awful lot of pushback to that. And I am not sure with an election coming that the government wants to cause that sort of controversy. It's something that a new government under, a different colour might want to look at, but it would have long-term implications, I agree, because once you've got that ban in place, when would you reverse it? I mean, what they're doing in Scotland, of course, is every 6 months they're reviewing it. So it could well be that everything said about Scotland will be completely different in September. We just don't know. I think a temporary rent freeze or temporary limit on what you can do to increase the rent in Scotland, if you're going to do anything at all, was the way to go. I would be very disappointed from the market sector if they had a permanent ban on rent increase or whatever. And I don't think they could, because the PRS is now so important. If landlords suddenly decide we're exiting, where are people going to live? If we suddenly dump, a couple of 100,000 properties on the market every month or so, what's that going to do to house prices? And, believe it or not, a lot of house owners are the people who vote for the Tory party. So I think the government have got lots of juggling to do, but I don't think they'll introduce a complete ban on rent increase. I really don't. I may be wrong, but I don't think so.
I would be amazed. I think well, I mean, there's been a lot of change actually, so neither of us should put our name to saying never. That's probably not wise. Sanika asks, what is the minimum amount of notice given to a tenant for rent increases? I presume she's maybe referring to moving forwards in the world of the suggested reform, maybe.
Well, we don't know. At the moment, it's 1 period or 1 month or whatever your tenancy agreement says. So it's quite clear. In the future, in the white paper, they're suggesting at least 2 months' notice. So if you're doubling the length of time the tenant has got to sort of come up with the extra money. Whether that's going to be in the final bill, we just don't know. But at the moment, it's 1 month. In the future, it may be 2. What we see in the bill will be what it will be.
Okay, let's move on. Sarah, if you go to the next slide, please. So, short-term lets.
Yeah, just really run through this. There's been a bit of a problem over the last few years in different parts of the country with the number of homes that are available for long-term let just shrinking. I'll give you an example. I think I saw a figure once which said over the last 5 years, the number of properties, say Cornwall, that are available for long-term let for homes has dropped by 70%. That's a phenomenal number. And if you go to Scotland, where, yes, they lost the equivalent of a Section 21 notice back in 2017, some landlords have exited the market, but more recently, since the pandemic, a lot of landlords say, look, I don't want to rent my property as a home to someone to live in. I want it on the holiday market, Airbnb, whatever it may be. So I know at the beginning of the academic year, Glasgow and Edinburgh, their universities had phenomenal problems trying to get second and third year students into private accommodation because a lot of them have been converted, holiday homes, Airbnb. So governments both north and south of the border have got to consider what can we do to perhaps not stop this trend, but to make it less attractive for landlords to take properties away from the PRS and put them into what I call the holiday market, short-term, that's what you want to call them. Now, in Scotland, they've come up with two, I think, pretty good ideas. Number one, they've said in Scotland, if a local authority thinks they've got a particular problem losing properties from the PRS, they can change their own planning regulations. In other words, you could have a special edict in your borough in Scotland saying if you want to take this property out of the PRS system and put it into holiday lets, Airbnb, whatever, you need planning permission. And some local authorities, Edinburgh in particular, have gone down that route already. The other thing they're saying in Scotland, if you want to rent out a property and it's not the tenant's home, it's not their principal residence, you need to get a license. Now, south of the border, we're used to licenses for HMOs, for selective licensing. North of the border, it's now licensing for effectively holiday homes, but they don't call them holiday homes. They call them properties that are occupied, usually short-term, by people who are not using them as their principal residence. So yes, effectively holiday homes. So would you believe if you have a wigwam, which you're renting out to a tourist, you need a license for that. If you are one of those very few people that own a lighthouse and you want to rent it out for holiday purposes, you need a license. There are whole lists in the legislation as to the sort of properties that need a license and those that don't. One of those that don't need a license is a bothy, and that's described as a single-storey building with no utility services at all, no gas, no water, no electricity, and at least 100 metres from a road. So you don't need a licence for that. But there are all sorts of properties, all catalogued in the Scottish legislation to say you will need a licence if you want to go down that particular route. Now, that may be the way to stop people leaving the PRS and going into the short-term or holiday market. We're not that coordinated south of the border. Yes, local authorities have the ability to increase council tax in certain circumstances on second homes, and the Welsh Assembly are doing great guns there. If you've got a second home in Wales, you're going to be paying far more tax than you would have done 5 or 6 years ago. But what they're saying in England is, well, hang on a moment, we've identified that a lot of people who take their property out of the PRS call it a holiday home, but don't actually put it on the market as a holiday home. Now, you might say, well, why would people do that? And the answer again is council tax. If you have a second property, you would normally pay full council tax on that. If you have a holiday home, a holiday let, that technically, believe it or not, is a business. And of course, if you have a business property, you don't pay council tax, you pay business rates. And odds are business rates on a holiday home will be a lot less than the council tax. So we have an awful lot of properties, especially down in Cornwall, that have left the PRS. They may be a holiday home, but they're not always rented out as a holiday home. But landlords are trying to mitigate their outgoings by saying, I'm not paying council tax, I'm paying business rates. Well, the new rules from the 1st of April say in that scenario, if you're calling your second or subsequent properties holiday accommodation, it's got to be rented out for at least 70 days in any tax year, and it's got to be available to be rented out for at least 140 days in any tax year. Otherwise, you won't qualify for that business allowance. You'll be paying the council tax. Now, this all impacts on Airbnb, holiday accommodation, especially in key areas like Devon and Cornwall, where we have a large influx of tourists. But it also emphasises the fact that at the moment we don't have a proper register of what properties people own. Yes, the land registry knows what every owner is of their property, but we don't have a single register. Now, contrast that in Scotland, where in Scotland, if I'm the Scottish First Minister, I can press a button on my computer and get a list of all the landlords in Scotland. In Wales, effectively, we have the same because landlords got to register. In England, we don't. So a couple of things to bear in mind. They have talked about setting up a register in England and Wales for second home owners. And in the white paper, which we discussed a moment ago, there is talk about bringing in a single ombudsman service that every private landlord must belong to. Now, of course, if you're a landlord and you must belong to the service, that effectively is going to be a register of all the landlords in this country, their properties, etc., etc. So again, we're a little bit behind Scotland, we're a little bit behind Wales, because we just don't know what landlords there are out there and what properties they own. So all this is going to be changing over the next year. But certainly from the 1st of April, we do have these new rules on holiday accommodation, what you have to do if you want to qualify for business rates as opposed to council tax on any property your client's letting out as a holiday accommodation.
And as part of the reform, the government also notes the introduction of a property portal, which essentially, I think, the idea being this will bind all of this together and give a place in which you can submit and register your properties, etc. That also, I think, will be extremely lenient on the UPRN number being introduced as the mainstay for the way everything's attached to a property. So it should be noted that the utilisation of UPRNs is going to be absolutely crucial, I think, to the delivery of all of these things. And there's going to be multiple benefits, I think, actually long-term for letting agents and landlords to have essentially a property logbook of which you can see all of your things pertaining to that property against them, from insurance claims all the way through to tax. I expect there to be seismic change here in this area in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But these things are going to take time, aren't they, in terms of actually getting introduced, but also then finding a level that is easy to access, that actually works. And I suppose the running thing through all of this that we've not covered so far is enforcement. You can have all the legislation in the world that ultimately, if it's not enforced, it doesn't really mean much. And there's clearly a question of how well that we can enforce legislation in our sector, full stop. And more, that question becomes more important, I think, as more and more changes are introduced.
No, I totally agree. I mean, back in 2016, the government woke up to the fact that local authorities didn't really want to prosecute agents or landlords because it cost the local authority money. What would happen is they'd prosecute an agent, prosecute a landlord. There'd be a massive fine because technically for an offence, fines could be unlimited. But the local authority wouldn't get that fine. It would go to central government. So what's the incentive on the local authority to spend ratepayers' money taking you or me or an agent to court? Well, that changed in 2016. Since then, we've had civil penalty notices. So effectively, if you commit an offence, local authorities got the ability to give you what offence is a parking ticket. It's a bit of paper, it's a fine, and you have to pay it. And that can be up to £30,000. Now, whether they are going to increase that limit to give more incentive to local authorities, I don't know. But the great thing about civil penalty notices is the local authority that issues the parking fine gets to keep the money. So when this first sort of kicked in, 5 or 6 years ago, you did find a lot of boroughs, especially in London, employing people to walk up and down high streets, going into agents' offices and saying, have you got your fee chart up on the wall? And if they didn't, it was a £5,000 fixed penalty notice there and then. And of course, that money went to employ somebody else to do more enforcement, employed somebody else to do more enforcement, and the whole thing grew. Now, London is pretty hot on this. I have to say, out in the provinces, I don't think local authorities have really woken up to the possibilities yet. But if the government wants to kick-start that scheme or increase that civil penalty limit from 30,000 to say 50,000, yeah, there would be an incentive in there for more enforcement. But you're right. Local authorities have got so much on their plate at the moment. Very often, housing is at the bottom of the list, as it is sometimes for many governments, I'm afraid. But my personal opinion, that's not Dutton Gregory's opinion, okay?
Let's move on to our last slide. This is extremely interesting. And I think we should start with just a sort of byline that, we clearly recognise that anybody should have access to a property. And that should be based, and those decisions should be based on affordability. There should be one simple model to assess whether somebody should have a property or not. And that's a sort of, it's a prerequisite really in terms of our view. But there's something quite interesting happening around an individual called Natalie Campbell. And Robert, talk us through what's going on here and some sort of a precedence case as well, and how we've got to this point, because I think our viewers are going to be super interested in what's happening here.
Natalie Campbell is a 39-year-old single woman who lives in a rented property in Surrey. Okay, Surrey, southeast last time I checked. And over the last couple of years, she's taken to writing and contacting agents right the way across the country. And what she says is, look, I've seen this property on your portal. I'd like a viewing, please, because I'm relocating to your area. Oh, by the way, I'm a DSS benefit applicant. Now, we haven't had DSS since 2001, but we know what she means. She's on benefits. And what she is looking for is an agent who writes back and says, oh, I'm terribly sorry, it's our policy or it's the landlord's policy, we don't take benefit applicants. That's what she is looking for. I personally doubt she's ever had any intention of leaving her accommodation in Surrey, but this is the approach she takes right the way across the country. Now, if you write back and say, sorry, that's our policy, the next thing you will get is a claim for compensation on the grounds of indirect discrimination. Now, let's talk about discrimination. You cannot discriminate against an individual who has got what we call a protected characteristic. So that's your sex, gender, that could be your colour, your creed, whatever. You cannot discriminate against that person. So if I said, for example, no, we are not going to take any applications from tenants who have got one leg or they're black or they're women, that is direct discrimination, and that is 100% completely wrong. Indirect discrimination is a bit more subtle. If your policy just so happens to catch more people who have got one of those protected characteristics, that's what the courts call indirect discrimination. Now, she bases her claim on this case in York, about 2000, 2001, I think it's 21. Now, what happened in that case is somebody applied to an agent up in York and wanted accommodation, but again, was a benefit applicant. Now, they were turned down because of a blanket policy that an agent operated, quite illegally, but they operated a blanket policy. And the applicant said, look, you've turned me down, I am on benefits, but it so happens, if you look across the country, there are more females on benefit than males. And I think your case is actually a single parent. So there are more single parents who are female on benefit than males. Now, rightly or wrongly, the judge in the York case said, well, that's indirect discrimination because it just so happens that your policy does catch more women and gender is a protected characteristic, therefore it's indirect discrimination. And in the York case, there was compensation awarded. Now, the weird thing about the York case is, number one, it was at the county court level, and one county court decision does not necessarily bind another county court. Two county courts come up with completely different answers. But the other weird thing about the court case is the compensation was actually negotiated between the parties. The judge didn't say what the compensation was. Now, take a step back. If you get a letter from Natalie Campbell and you say, I'm sorry, landlord won't take benefit, she will write to you and say, indirect discrimination. Here is all the paperwork from the York case. You can see you're wrong. I want £8,300 compensation. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, Oli, I don't know how many times this woman has done this over the last 2 or 3 years. What I do know is we've had 3 cases recently where this modus operandi has been to the fore. Now, we are one firm of lawyers in one part of the country. So if I've had 3 cases in the last couple of weeks, how many other cases are there out there?
But just on this, Robert, how is she? Sorry, how is she suggesting? Given, and you mentioned her location at the top of the point here. How can she genuinely prove that she had any real ambition or desire to move into the property? She's not suffered material loss here because she never wanted the property in the first place, surely.
No, she can't throw loss, but you put yourself in the position of an agent. You've got all this paperwork coming in, you've got all the notes from your case, and this woman is saying, we're going to take you to court for thousands and thousands of pounds. The alternative is, why don't you give us a payment now, or we'll call it quits and go away. And I have to say, a lot of agents will do that. Shelter has almost got a scale of charges. The last time we had this with a shelter-backed tenant, I think Shelter took £3,000. Now, to be honest, if you're being threatened with court case of 10 grand or whatever, and someone says, we'll take £3,000 anyway, what are you going to do? And a lot of agents will write that cheque for a smaller amount just to get it off their books. Because you think about it, we can talk about insurance in a moment, but if you have a PI insurance policy which might cover you on this, odds are your policy excess is going to be more than what the woman is asking for. So she's very clever. If you do a settlement, she insists that you sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. So in theory, you can't even discuss this at your local agents meeting with other people in your town. You can't let them know what's gone on. So she could be doing this to 2 or 3 agents in every street, in every part of the country, and we'd never know. So what I'm doing at the moment for one agent up in Nottingham who's been caught, we're fighting a case in the Guildford County Court, and we're saying to the judge, this is ridiculous. Number one, we think it's a fraudulent claim. She's fishing, to use that term. And number two, we want it struck out of the grounds of entrapment and public policy. Now, if I go in front of the judge and say, I can prove she's done this 2 other cases, that's good. But if I can say she's done it in 24 other cases, that is much, much better. So what I've got on this slide here is my email address and the telephone number for our helpline. And well, ideally, I'd like, if anybody's watching this and they have had an experience with Natalie Campbell from a flat in Surrey, claiming to be a benefit claimant, could they let us know? Now, on the NDA, the non-disclosure bit, no non-disclosure agreement can bind you as an agent if you're seeking legal advice from your solicitor. So if you contact us, you become our client at that point. So the non-disclosure agreement would not be binding in discussions we have with my office. So all I'm saying is, look, if you're out there, if you're an agent and you've come across a Natalie Campbell from a flat in Surrey, aiming to rent a property in your area and she's on benefit, can you please get in touch? That's the helpline number. That's my email. And we'll come back to you and we'll have a chat about it. But we just got to publicise this somehow, because discrimination is wrong. It's totally wrong. But this is not the way to solve it. We solve it through education, not through what I call this blackmail. I mean, this is what effectively all it is. People are terrified of going to court. We need to solve it. We need to educate agents out there, but we need to stop the Natalie Campbells. And this is not the first fishing trip that people have had trying to get money out of agents under what I would call false pretenses. But that's what we've got now.
Very interesting. And I think interesting the fact she's reporting to be on benefits, but clearly generating thousands of pounds in benefit through this action, which I imagine she's not disclosing. So I'm not sure it'll end very well.
If I get a few of people saying, yes, we've paid out £8,000 or £9,000, my next email will be to the fraud department of her local benefit office, because it's not right. I mean, she is claiming benefit. We don't know if she is. It's your money, it's taxpayers' money. And she's conning the industry as well. There you are. I've said enough. That's my soapbox today, Ollie, I'm afraid.
Okay. We've got a few questions. I'm conscious we've run over time, so I want to try and keep these as short as we possibly can. I do thank everybody for joining us. I've got one that says, tell Robert Martin 80 is watching. He'll know who I am. We've done 14 cases this year. So I don't know whether he means he's done 14 cases relating to Natalie Cooper. If that is the case, then I would urge you to reach out to Robert as quickly as possible, because that's going to be quite seismic.
Star witness.
Yeah. I've got a question from, we've had this in, where is it gone? Sorry, apologies. John, good morning, John. I manage licensed HMOs with bills included in the rent in England. Can I increase the housemaid's payment every 6 months if utility bills are increasing?
No, not unless you have a rent increase clause written into your tenancy agreement. If you have, you might get away. If you haven't, then you're relying on a Section 13 note at the end of the fixed term, and you can only do a Section 13 once a year. So yeah, I mean, I have to say the days of including utilities in the rent are gone. It's just a complete disaster. You know, since Putin marched into Ukraine, it's been a complete disaster zone for those sort of landlords.
Emma, some of our landlords, good morning, Emma. Some of our landlords say no to students. Is this direct or indirect discrimination? They say no due to income. Well,
I would probably say you're not taking them because of the affordability issue. It's security, it's affordability. I hate to say whether it is or isn't indirect discrimination. I hope we have roughly 50-50 male and female students in this country. But I'd be very reluctant to say no students, because all you're doing is opening a potential Pandora's box with the National Students' Union. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that if they want to try and recruit a few more students to their union, yeah, let's have a case in court that gets into the press. So we never say no to a group, we say no on affordability.
Another point from somebody who's not left the name, but good morning nonetheless. Thank you, really informative. That's our pleasure. Two things. Will we receive a copy of the recording? You will indeed. This will be sent out following the webinar. And on a different note, the change to the How to Rent guide that changes tomorrow, will the amended documents be uploaded to Goodlord for the start of the tenancy for renewals? Do agents using the platform need to do anything? One, yes, the new copy of the How to Rent guide will be uploaded. And two, no, agents don't need to do anything. I'll take the opportunity to argue that's a very good selling point of Goodlord. Rest assured that we manage all of that for you, and you don't need to change anything. The platform will automatically update. We are out of time. We've run over by 7 minutes. I appreciate there's a few questions that have been left over. Hopefully we've covered the majority of them now. Thank you so much to the hundreds and hundreds of letting agents and property professionals that have joined this morning. Robert, thank you to you. A really, really informative session, as that viewer says, and I think a plethora of topics to cover there, some of which will become more and more important as the weeks and months go on. So hopefully we can sort of join forces again in the coming months as we learn more about the Reform Bill, and hopefully as the government signpost where we're heading a bit more, we can come back to this group hopefully and give them a further update as and when we have information. But for now, to everyone that's joined, to Robert, thank you so much for your time. Take care, and we'll see you soon.